for us. Cuturi Gallery has been, quite open to ideas. It's not my first time suggesting to do something here, collaborating with the gallery. So thank you, Kevin. Yeah. So again, thank you for coming on this Saturday afternoon, spending your time here. I think I should start the afternoon by sort of introducing my fellow speakers. On my right, we have Sarah Ichioka. It's actually quite interesting or a bit funny because I sort of, when I was writing for the curatorial essay, I was sort of struggling, to be honest. That's why, curators, writers, we always try to expand the deadline. And I was struggling to sort of start and how to frame his works in this essay. And one of the things or the sparks that sort of got me started to sort of imagine this show, at least in text, was Sarah's article, which I think was published in a Channel News Asia commentary piece. I forgot the title. The title is cited. It's actually about something about rewilding Singapore, because I think it was an article that was sort of commenting and observing about the grass patches, some of the plants and shrubs that were sort of left undisturbed because of certain factors, during the circuit breaker period. So I thought that was a good segue or entry point to talk about how, at least for me as a curator for the show, to sort of approach Kai's work. So back to Sarah. So I sort of, do the Google thing, and then I found out, wow, she is actually in Singapore, right? So I thought, let's try to get her on board to sort of, talk about this idea, because she provided me the inspiration to write the essay. So she leads Desire Lines, which is essentially a consultancy for environmental, cultural, and a social impact organization and initiative. And she has won a host of awards. I might have missed some, but she's a British Council Claw Fellow, International Fellow. She's an honorary Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. She's worked with major galleries and published in major publications by Koenig, worked with Serpentine Gallery, the Sole Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism, Barbican, and the list goes on. If you wish to know more about Sarah's work, advocate work, and environmental and cultural initiatives, you can, of course, talk to her after this session. On my left, of course, we have Khairulddin Wahab, whose works here are on display, and which we are having the pleasure of enjoying them in this nice gallery. Khairulddin and I go quite a long way back. We met during our diploma days. I was studying arts management degree in LaSalle, which is just not too far away from here. He was doing his diploma in fine arts. Yep. So since then, I've always found his paintings to be quite strong for me visually. So over the years, it has been a pleasure sort of looking at him develop. He was a friend, but we've never really worked closely up till this solo showcase. So he's participated in various local and regional shows. Recent exhibitions include the Jogja Biennale in Yogyakarta, Sea Focus, the renowned local art fair, and of course his name became a bit more public when he won the UOB Top Prize in 2018. Yep. So I would say that was around the time or just after that when we sort of started talking about doing a solo show, working together. Because in the art world, it's sort of more, I guess, for an artist, it's more satisfying to work towards a cohesive showcase of a particular set of ideas. So yeah, so I sort of took up the challenge, and I would say it has been quite a long project to come to what it is today. So for this afternoon, it's not a lecture or anything. It's supposed to be a conversation. So you feel free to ask questions or interject at any point of time. And I was thinking perhaps I will start with some questions to get the ball rolling. So perhaps I can start with Kai. Usually I call him Kai. So yeah. So maybe perhaps you can. I mean, of course, we had those discussions at the kopitiam and all that, but a bit more to sort of summarize essentially what this series of works, The Word for World is Forest, is about.
Okay, so the title is from a novel by Ursula K. Guin. She's a science fiction writer, and basically I thought about the title because, so the works are not entirely kind of inspired by the novel, but more like that particular novel deals with certain themes that I found that kind of have a similar or common thread with the ideas that I'm interested in. For example, like colonialism, environmental history, and something like natural science, taxonomy. So when I was thinking about a title for the show, I felt like it was kind of apt to adopt this title. And also I kind of like the way that the word for world is forest kind of rings. There's a kind of
poetic.
It's a kind of poetic like ring to it, but also like it sounds like it makes sense, but it doesn't really make sense at the same time. It's like, because the word for world is forest, like what does that even mean? So I thought it was a nice title for the exhibition. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about make sense, it sort of also surfaces the idea of the enchantment and disenchantment of another core idea.
So for me, the central theme behind all the works that connect all the works is this notion of disenchantment and also re-enchantment. So by disenchantment, I mean that this kind of cultural rationalization or kind of desecularization of knowledge or of a particular kind of context. For example, when colonialism came to Southeast Asia, they brought, for example, monoculture or natural science or taxonomy. So these are ways of seeing the world from a specific lens. So for example, naturalists like Wallace or Darwin, they came to Southeast Asia, I mean Wallace especially, and they would study the plant life or the wildlife and see it from this kind of taxonomical lens. So, and when you do it, it's kind of, you kind of take away or you strip away a certain kind of contextual aspect to whatever you're kind of looking at. So, for example, there's a painting that is in front, it's called Till the Ground. So it's depicting like a classroom, and then it's agricultural botany class. So the idea behind that painting that I was looking at is this idea of how like botany or taxonomy is kind of like a Western perspective. And it's a way to demystify how plants or how crops grow, or how plants kind of, photosynthesize or whatever. So this kind of education and something that is, in a way, kind of a Western kind of perspective, and then you kind of demystify something that is rooted here. So that's a way to disenchant, like nature, for example. And like the act of representing it or painting this kind of scenes is also kind of a way to re-enchant things. So representing like an archival image, for example, is a way to kind of give it this power, so that you, from something that is disenchanted, you kind of re-enchant it. And the thread that runs through all this work, they kind of talk about basically disenchantment and different aspects of disenchantment. Yeah.
I mean, talking about enchantment, I mean, one of the reasons that Sarah's article like touched me and made me sort of like almost jump with joy, because it was the same sensation I felt when sort of during circuit breaker, like almost all of us were in our own headspace, jogging alone or cycling alone, and you sort of have more time to encounter, to look at things, to observe things. It was like really a downtime, both you know, on a day-to-day basis, professional basis, and for me, on a mental basis, right? So when I read the article, I said, yes, this is it. This was what I felt, right? So perhaps maybe Sarah, we can start with what was it based on an interview, or was there an invitation to respond to that phenomenon when you wrote that article from CNA? I mean.
Of course. First of all, I just want to thank you for bringing us together for this conversation and congratulate Kai on your really magnificent show and fantastic solo debut. And thanks everyone for joining us in conversation. I really look forward to your questions afterwards. So that piece, which I'm so glad found you, or you found, arose out of several years of conversation with a former colleague who's now become a dear friend, who's a landscape architect based at NUS, Professor Yunhai Quang, and she has been working tirelessly for the last decade, I'd say, to try to move away from Singapore and much of the so-called developed world's enforced disciplinary approach to landscape, to looking at really embracing the incredible atmospheric abundance of the tropical context, and the fact that nature here will, if you just leave her alone, absolutely flourish forth. And she'd been working on this in a fairly isolated way on certain beautiful test cases, mostly on the NUS campus. But we both were just exchanging a flurry of text messages with other like-minded friends also during the first CB of just like pictures of all of these places where nature was just
flourishing,
breathing, right? She was so happy to have this space. And I had previously written another opinion piece for that editor, and I knew that she was very open to new ideas, even challenging ones that were potentially challenging. So we just, over the course of the week, maybe like your CoPTM chats around the work, just kind of, it grew out of a friendship and a shared passion for this idea of looking at an approach to landscape that is built on the idea of care and reciprocity as opposed to control.
Yeah, control, because that's one of the also the key themes when one looks at some of the research materials in Kai's paintings, right? I mean, the encounter with nature is also to a certain degree about a form of control, to be in control, what is before you, how you map the land, and talking about mapping, of course we have Pak Tony or Uncle Tony here, who generously contributed one of the other essays, which me and Kai also thought would add a certain amount of robustness to what we're talking about. Because in terms of the natural landscape, botanical practices, taxonomy practices, of course you can't escape the gaze of the human eyes in terms of knowing what's there. So of course his expertise in cartography is also now on display in National Library on the 10th floor. Coincidentally, there's an exhibition called Human Nature. Yeah, so he has illustrated or produced four maps to sort of complement the exhibition there. So it's still open, I think, until the end of September. Yeah. So there's still time to sort of see his wonderful illustrations and sort of also, the site. I mean, not the site, but actually the main message is bringing back the art of cartography, which I said, okay, Pak Tony, you can have fun in this essay and wrote what you want to write, which you weren't able to do in the NLB National Library exhibition. So going back to Sarah, from what I understand, you were not based in Singapore previously. right? So now that you've been living here for quite some time, what are some of like the main things that you notice? I mean, being from the outside and then coming in terms of how society here react or understand, this idea of environmentalism, even in terms of like NGO, in the NGO sphere, environmental work. Yeah, what are the things?
How long do you have? I think maybe that's such a big question. I might maybe hone it in a little bit to think about relationship with landscape in the first instance. And I spent a good year and a half when I first landed here as a research fellow with the National Parks Board in a colonial bungalow, probably with a traveler's palm nearby in the Singapore Botanic Gardens, which is how I know Prof. Wang. And so that was an amazing crash course in just understanding this incredible depth of expertise and commitment from government, civil service, scientists employed there, and then also developing capacities of the private sector and growing capacities of civil society around the idea of landscape, the Singapore biodiversity agenda, et cetera. So that was on a professional level. But then on a more personal level, I think I come back to the word abundance again, that just something about, coming from living in northern, what we could then at the time still call Europe. You can guess where that might have been. Coming from that climate to here, and just how much closer the temperature is to body temperature most of the year round. And that, I think I'm still processing what that effect has been on my practice and how I see the world. But what I find interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Kai, as well, is I feel there's this sort of tension between, there's a general received and embraced narrative of city and nature city and nature, formerly city and a garden. We all generally believe that biodiversity is a good thing. We've all, during the last 2 strange years, come to appreciate even more our green spaces near our homes. And there's been a flourishing of home gardening, et cetera. But I still feel like that's in tension with a certain aesthetic or social expectation of control and cleanliness. And, like two quick examples. And then, one, so I often work with architects, and the vertical green agenda here is really remarkable. But you will so often see these spectacular buildings that are designed to welcome biodiversity, but then are maintained by groups of cheaply paid migrant workers in harnesses, making sure every stray voluntary weed is pulled out of the facade. And you think, well, actually, if you embrace the abundance of the fact that these are the plants that want to be there, wouldn't that be more true to the spirit of the city and nature? Or similarly, neighbors who probably want to report me to the NIA for rewelding my lawn, but which to them is just dengue danger. But they grow these beautiful flowers and beautiful vegetables, but they send their helper out every day to remove every stray leaf from the top, to the point that they're actually growing it basically in marine clay with artificial fertilizers, topping it up. So there's this, this sort of tension between really enjoying the growing, but then also wanting to aesthetically control it in a way that actually means that the ecosystem is depleted.
Yeah, I guess control is a theme that you could see in different aspects of this in the works, in the sense that I think humans or man we are predisposed to wanting control over our environment. So things like cartography or taxonomy or botany, it's a way to understand, and also a way to, from that understanding, from that knowledge, is a way to kind of make sense of your place in the world and also what's around you. So it's also kind of a form of control, because we are not comfortable with something that is unknown. So for example, like cartography, I think it's a way to kind of map out the land around you. And I guess on a deeper level, it's also a way to know what's around you. And from that, you gain a form of control, because with a map, you kind of, okay, I know where I'm going, or I know what's there, maybe stay away from that place. So I think this control that you talk about, it exists under the surface of the ideas that I'm kind of working with. Yeah.
So what I really like, I love your term disenchantment and reenchantment, because I think it relates back to, I think there are so many different, so yes, I totally agree that right now humans most often will manifest a desire to control, but that in its best state, the root for that is really our desire to know.
Yeah.
And perhaps we are, in certain structures, we've been conditioned to think that the best way of knowing something is controlling it. But what I love about the way you complicate that with the framework, the frame of enchantment, is, are there different ways to know that diverge from the narrative of control? And what learnings from past, from previous cultures, or what can we imagine that would align knowing with reenchantment or rewilding?
Yeah. Looking at your work as the curator or an art historian, right? I mean, because I was privy to your process of how you're mining images, mining certain colors, mining certain pigments to come up with this final image that we see on the wall, right? It's also a sort of a form of control there on your part, right?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, as I think mentioned about the act of painting, representing the material is kind of making something, re-enchanting something, because it's like there's this objecthood to painting, for example. It's like taking a vase from some native culture and putting it in a museum. You imbue a sense of enchantment to it, because you look at it as an object, and perhaps the culture and the context of the object is, sure, it's kind of educational. It's framed in a sense that it's an educational kind of framework, but there's this kind of flow of something that is disenchanted, re-enchanted. It ebbs and flows, so it's not static to me. So something can be disenchanted or re-enchanted, continuously or simultaneously. So that's the kind of idea that I'm interested in, because for me, like in the context of Southeast Asia, it's something that I see, for example, in material culture, like textiles. Textiles is a source of material that I'm actually inspired by. So sometimes I let slip, like I incorporate patterns into my painting, like the triangle here, for example. So, but for example, the colors or the way that I approach a painting, it's also partly influenced by textiles. So for example, how a textile is printed and it's using positive and negative space to create this depth. So in my paintings, I like to kind of use this positive and negative space. So this kind of harks back to this source material where I feel like textiles, for example, like batik or stuff like that, it's an embodied form of like disenchantment, re-enchantment, because so like the motifs or the textiles is the culture, and it's it can be lost, but also it can be kind of ignited. So for example, if you use a batik and you make a nice dress out of it, usually because of its nature as applied arts, there's something lost there because you see like, oh, it's a very nice dress, really nice patterns, but the motifs that is usually in these textiles, there's very deep meanings around it. So an example would be this particular triangle that I use in this painting, and you can see on the other side of the wall. It's called Pucuk Rebong. So Pucuk Rebong is a kind of Malay motifs. It's supposed to symbolize bamboo shoots. So I found it interesting because like different cultures have different interpretations of this particular motif. Like the bamboo is important in like Southeast Asia, and for example, the Japanese would have a different interpretation, the Chinese would have different, and for this particular Southeast Asian one, it's each sort of triangle, each layer is supposed to denote different planes of reality. So the top would be like God, and then it would be different kind of planes of reality. So to me, it's interesting because I've seen this pattern in a lot of places, even in architecture. So that sometimes you see it in like on a roof, and then it's like a pattern that is below the roof. But I've never really thought about what it means or if it's got any meaning, because for me it's just a pattern. But as I was like doing more research about it, then I realized that there's all these motifs that are so rich in kind of meaning, and it's kind of lost when it's applied. So that's part of the I guess interest that I find in like textiles.
If I could just pick up on that, is that right?
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about that reference too in the context of our themes today is the fact that if you look at fiber arts historically, they're so deeply related to the specific flora of a given, and fauna as well, if you think about wool, et cetera. And that there's often I've been reading a lot about, I'm originally from California, and I've been reading a lot about indigenous Californians' practices of reciprocal tending of the land. And there's many different localized traditions around basketry and weaving that specifically related to the long-term tending of wild-grown specific kinds of reeds, straws, etc. And so I think it's really interesting to think at the level of pattern and then also at the level of the materiality of it and how that relates to landscape.
Yeah, so...
The pattern of your shirt.
Oh yeah.
Talk about your shirt.
It's supposed to be like...
Inspired by ikat weaving.
So sometimes I kind of get a bit excited about patterns and I incorporate it into my paintings. So you can see some patterns here and there, but I try not to represent that too literally because I don't want to do something like just copying a pattern and then just pasting on my painting. So like if I use it, it's because I feel like certain meanings that I want to kind of work into the work. Yeah. But it's quite subtle. I feel like if I don't mention it, like it's usually kind of lost on people, because it's more like the approaches to creating the work is like textile approaches to creating patterns, for example.
So I mean I'm just listening into the conversations, but it has been some of the topics that you mentioned about textile and fiber arts, for example, right? Because recently I'm sort of involved with the Malay Heritage Center, and they have a collection of some not a big major one like the National Museum, but some collection of like certain healing utensils that were sort of important to certain medicinal recipes in the Malay world. And it didn't escape the fact that some of these were alluding to certain plants, certain aspects of the natural world. So at least for me, as someone who's sort of interested in the visual culture of the Malay world, it's also quite interesting to see the I guess the dialogue, the syncretism of these systems of knowledge, right? Which is also the anchor or the main thing that sort of attracted me to Kai's current series of work, because for me, essentially, if there's a framework that sort of, for me at least, I mean, I'm not sure for you, about how to sort of bring together, tie together all these works, is basically a critique of different systems of knowledge, right? Whether it's rationality in the Western sense, or spirituality at the local indigenous level, certain vernacular, tools, languages that were used or sort of co-opted, and then sort of redistributed via visual culture, via textual references. I mean, these were some of the things that sort of jumped out at me when I was looking at this series of works. So, which sort of, I mean, we'll open questions to the floor soon, but perhaps before we go there, maybe maybe some last thoughts about how, maybe with Sarah, right? Like how do you think like this, generally the field of art or design can sort of help improve or help us to understand better this field of environment, the field of this environmentalism causes that's been on the rise in recent years.
That's such a good
Maybe
question.
via your work, your professional work, right?
So, I mean, let's be honest with each other. We all have a necessary and urgent part to play in cultural transformation right now. And we have a very clear timeline for it. And which is essentially about the actual literal survival of culture. So I think that everyone has a clear role to play, and since one of the major challenges in that transformation is thinking about our position as Homo sapiens in relation to the rest of nature and the rest of the environment, that cultural practitioners, including visual artists, have a huge role to play in helping us rethink that frame and presenting new alternative narratives in a way that's not didactic per se, and can have a way of reaching different parts of people's minds than other forms of communication.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that, Kai, you made reference to Ursula K. Le Guin, but I think so many people now are looking to science fiction and fantasy writers, whether it's Le Guin, Octavia K. Butler. You have a science fiction writer writing the lead opinion piece in the Financial Times two weekends ago. So we really are at this, Margaret Atwood, we're at this point of feeling like, oh my gosh, what the heck comes next? Yeah. We have no precedent for this. But what's really, I think the really, really most urgent role, and it's not to say at all that visual artists should be instrumentalized as propagandists, but it's really thinking about non-dystopian futures, helping us imagine a non-dystopian future, because actually so many of the transitions that we need to collectively undergo could lead to very positive outcomes for so many people. Yeah. But right now we've so much of our, especially like mainstream cultural science fiction, what gets made into blockbusters is the deeply, deeply dystopian. Yeah. And that ends up being, if you eat too many carrots, you turn orange, right? It's like that. But that I think that, and that doesn't have to be utopian, right? Yeah. But I think it also, the best fantasy writers are the ones who also have, like Le Guin's parents were anthropologists, right? Yeah. So she would have had that same layering of deep historical understanding in her depictions of future or fantasy worlds. So I see a very strong role to play, and I have plenty of examples I could cite, but I think it's, I'm happy to discuss them with people after.
As an artist? Because, recently, in terms of the art world, like buzzwords like the Anthropocene has sort of gained traction, right? There are various artists with various, even residencies sort of looking for artists engaged with this topic. So from I guess from your point of view, what can be sort of a more productive way of engaging?
That's a very tough question. I guess for me, like I'm interested in this topic, like environmental history, for example, and like it's become a kind of source material for me to create work because it's what interests me in painting something. Because I'm not really interested in painting like just a pretty landscape and then it doesn't really have any meaning for me. So in a sense, I think in terms of your question, I feel like there's also a line where, for me, I don't really want, like I'm not an activist. I don't want to be kind of preachy about, the messages that I'm trying to communicate. So I think personally for me, it's just as I think Sarah mentioned, like offering kind of different ways of seeing things. So instead of like a binary like pro-environment or like pro-oil or something like that, it's like there are this kind of different, these are stories or where we don't really usually hear about. And I guess for me, as in my practice, it's about uncovering this kind of different perspectives of this particular topic and sharing it with my audience. So yeah, I'm not really sure if like I really answered your question, but
yeah. It's a good answer.
I guess it depends on an individual person's practice.
Yeah, it also depends on the kind of artistic inclinations that.
Yeah, if you're like a more like activist type, it's.
Of course. Yeah.
So
So on that note, I guess the floor is open for any questions. Can be about anything, from the works to Sarah's various projects, or even about the article, and also to me. Yes, Kansan.
Yeah, this is a question for Kai. I think purely from the visual point of view, when you walk into this room and you see the works, there are two things that strike me. One is the use of color, and the other is the way in which you use paint. All right. So you said earlier, mentioned about the influence of textiles, right? The positive, negative, and also probably in the use of color.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the issue of colors, and then also could you say something about the way in which you use paint?
Right. I guess in terms of colors, because textiles usually they don't use like natural colors to represent something, right? Like the sky is not necessarily blue, or the plants are not necessarily green. So in that sense, that's how I kind of develop this kind of palette. So to me, it's more interesting to make use of color in order to express a certain kind of feel. So not trying to represent the world like accurately, but using it as a way to, using the power of colors and the combination of different colors to kind of lend a specific kind of vibe to it in a way. And what was the next question?
The use of paint.
Okay, the use of paint. Yeah, so the use of paint, like which aspect of?
The way in which you handle paint.
Right, the way I handle paint. Okay, so yeah, I guess in a way, when I start a painting, it's usually on the ground, because I'm trying to create patterns or textures. So in that sense, I kind of, I guess it's a bit subconscious, but I was just thinking about how textiles are usually also prepared, like usually kind of stretch on vertically, horizontally. So in that sense, I feel like the way I approach a new painting is quite similar to someone who is trying to make a new kind of piece of textile. And then, so I thought about how the process of making a textile, like, like a print, so they would have either like a wax resist, so they would do that, and then they try to make the print, and then they would color it, and then when the wax kind of protects the previous layer. So in that sense, it's how I build up my image. I like to retain the pattern that I first start, and then I kind of play with the layers. So they are all acrylic paints, because one of the main reasons is the drying time, because I like to use up a lot of layers, and acrylic allows me to work really fast with that. So if I were to use oil, it would take a bit more time for me. Yeah. So yeah, I guess in that sense, that's how I handle paint. Yeah.
Thanks, Kansan. Any other questions from the floor?
Any questions from you?
Any questions? Oh yeah, Russell.
Yes, I'm interested in the source imagery that you use. I'm guessing you work from photographs.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you select them, and what kind of
Material.
are there specific references?
Yeah. So each work references a particular kind of. I got it from an image, a reference image from either the books or through my research. So the way I work is that if there's a particular idea that I want to express, for example, so this piece is actually is supposed to be a theodolite. So it's partly kind of inspired by the print in the National Museum, Road Surveying Interrupted by Heinrich Leutmann. So I was thinking about the act of surveying the land, like to map the land before you. And so I just kind of look for basically images of land surveyors, for example, this painting, in order to express this particular idea I had. And so this work is kind of talking about mapping the land, and how when you see the land before you through mathematical kind of planes, you kind of strip it away from the stories or histories of the piece of land. So yeah, this particular painting is about that. But in general, like I would either kind of mix the images that I found in order to create like this cohesive composition. Yeah. Or sometimes I feel like the image it expresses what I'm interested in, like very strongly, and then I just try to represent that, but through my own way of, I guess, representing it. Yeah, because I'm not really interested in copying an image like wholesale. Like, yeah. So it's basically trying to, I guess, emphasize some parts of the image and then just erasing some parts of the image. Yeah.
Do you work directly from the photo or the image that you find onto the canvas, or is there an intermediate stage?
Yeah, usually I would kind of, the process is to, like, I would have an image and then I would just play around with it a bit, and in terms of composition, or perhaps there's some part of the image I feel like I want to highlight more or I want to erase. So sometimes I would combine different images together because I feel like, as in I want to communicate a certain kind of idea, and through that use of, I guess through figuration, using, different figures that, different actions to communicate that. Yeah. So it's usually a process of kind of playing around with the source material. Yeah.
And digitally?
Yes, I work so digitally because it kind of makes things easier. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Congratulations on the exhibition.
Thank you.
I just want the sort of this ethereal kind of white man that's in a lot of the works. Is there any thoughts on that in terms of like what you're trying to communicate
Right.
with that? Or
It's mostly, the white man that you see is white because it's is based on it's usually is linen. So during the colonial times, like linen was the fabric of choice because it's light for the tropics. So they would wear kind of a linen costume, and they would have a plain hat or a hat. So it's more about, I guess, historical accuracy in the sense that this was the kind of clothes that people were wearing. Yeah. But also, I guess, their roles as in each painting, they kind of talk about different ideas. Yeah. So you have like the explorer in this variation on things, and then this is like I guess botanist. So they just have different roles, but it's just white because it's about the way the clothes that they're wearing. Yeah.
Some interesting questions. Yeah, maybe perhaps a last question before we close the session, and then we can sort of have a closer look at some of the works within the gallery. We won't go off, we'll still be here, so you can approach any of us.
Yeah.
Any more?
May I say something about
Yes, of course.
I really appreciated your essay, Tony, about cartography and sort of subversions and seeing the artist in the cartographer, and those the little hints of the historic analysis, and then your own work, right? Trying to reintroduce that and encouraging fellow professionals to incorporate that. There's something there's like an extra twist there that I really liked, thinking about the cartographer themselves as an artist.
I have a very warped sense of humour.
Yes, I've got
Even in my professionally prepared maps in environmental impact work, sometimes I sneak things in there nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
Little
Excellent.
animals,
Yeah.
fish or stuff. But I went overboard in these maps because I wanted to come back to, the really early maps where they were putting sea monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And I love sea monsters. They're such grotesque creatures. And, when you put them on the map, it gives you something to
throws you off.
appreciate in that world. So it's sort of like bringing back what was lost.
Yeah.
So I think part of the reason why, I guess I was thinking about your work was this particular painting that unfortunately is not featured in this show, but it was a painting of this kind of aerial view of I guess a forest. So, and I was thinking about how cartography is kind of an aerial view, right? It's an aerial view of the land, and I kind of made the connection between this ability to survey the land from the sky, and it's because it's not a natural, like we can't really get there unless we're on a plane, right? So this act of surveying the land from the sky is an unnatural one, and I was thinking about how it's also kind of a form of disenchantment, because when you're able to see something that is it's kind of like a God's eye view, it becomes there's this, I don't know, like this
Elevated.
Privileged
view.
Yeah, privileged view, and I was thinking about how, like, relating back to cartography and this desire to map and understand the environment. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why I thought about your work, and then discussed it with Hafiz about.
Yeah. Should get him to write something.
So both four maps are a study in land use change over the years, and to see what we've done.
Yeah.
The different approaches. For example, the early British approach was purely economical, plantations and that sort of thing. And now the modern approach is housing.
Yeah.
And now with the COP-ID, with people, the general population that has spilled out of the cinemas and shopping centres and found their way into the natural environment, they're discovering, they're in a mode of discovery, and they're making demands. And those demands are difficult to meet in terms of development, land use, and sort of stuff. It's very interesting to watch it go on now.
Yeah. So thank you again, Pak Tony, for sort of enlightening us to towards the world of cartography. Right?
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess on that note, I think we all want to stand up and walk around and wiggle our muscles. So yeah, thank you so much for being here, for the questions, and I hope the conversation continues. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
And thank you, Sarah.
Oh, yeah.
And thank you, Kai,
Thanks.
for coming down.
Thanks. Oh. There's no